Hi everyone, welcome. Thanks for joining us today. My name is Katie Hautamaki and I work for Midtown Reader, an independent bookstore here in Tallahassee, Florida. And we are joined today by Rana Tahir. Hi Rana.
Hi.
The author of this Choose Your Own Adventure novel. And she is going to be showing us how to brainstorm and write our own Choose Your Own Adventure stories. She is joining us from all the way across the country in Oregon. It's a bit of a, well, the sun's coming out now, but it's been a rainy afternoon here in Tallahassee as summer afternoons often are. So a good afternoon to stay inside and do some writing. So thank you for joining us, Rana. And thank you to ChooseCo, the publisher of the Choose Your Own Adventure series, for making this possible. The only things you will need for this workshop are paper and pencil and your own imagination. So if you need to run grab those things now, feel free to do that. I also want to let you know that we will allow some time for questions at the very end. There's a Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. So if you have any questions for Rana about writing, about Choose Your Own Adventure stories, about Noor Inayat Khan, who she's written about in this novel, about anything at all, feel free to submit those at any point during the event, and we'll take as many questions as we can at the end. So with that, I'm going to tell you a little bit about Rana and a little bit about the book, and then I'll turn it over to her. Rana Tahir is a Kundiman Fellow, a public school substitute teacher, and a teaching associate in the Department of English at Pacific University in Forest Grove, Oregon, where she earned her MFA. She was born in Pakistan and raised on the beaches of Kuwait. Her poetry and prose has been published in various literary publications and magazines such as Catch, The Interlochen Review, and Fresh Literary Magazine. Her first book of nonfiction, a biography of the poet Countee Cullen, was published in 2016 with Cavendish Square Press. Rana's book, Choose Your Own Adventure Spies, Noor Inayat Khan, takes you to Nazi-occupied France during World War II. You grew up surrounded by the lessons your parents valued most: nonviolence, music, writing, and the arts. When World War II begins, your dreams of traveling the world and helping people are quickly changed, and you leave your life behind to spy for the resistance as a British secret agent. Will the years of training you've had in the Special Operations Executive help you go undetected by your enemies, or will the long coil of your radio antenna end up giving you away? It's a pretty exciting story. I'm going to go ahead and give it over to you, Rana. Take it away.
Thank you. And thank you so much to Midtown Reader and everyone. We are going to just start with a basic sort of overview of what makes a story. Hopefully you have that paper and pencil ready to go. And I'm going to hope that the slide actually goes to the next one. No? Yes? Okay, there we go. Okay, so we're just going through the process in this workshop of thinking up your story. And we're going to think about it a little bit differently from how you would think of a normal narrative, right? So with any story, there's always four main elements, and those are your characters. So who are the people in your story? Who's the main shiro or hero? Your setting, where does the story take place and when does the story take place? Your conflict, so what's the problem, what's causing our main character to act? And then usually there's a resolution, which is how the story ends. But for those of you who are fans of Choose Your Own Adventure books, you know that there's not just one ending. So instead of focusing on an end, with Choose Your Own Adventure books, you're really focusing on the first choice that your character has to make. And it's usually a really big choice that sets the rest of the story in motion. So what I'd like you to do right now is, to help you brainstorm, just divide your paper up into 4 boxes, like you can see the example on the side here, and then label each of those boxes. So your first box is going to be character or characters. Actually, writing a Choose Your Own Adventure book from the point of view of multiple characters would be really interesting. Probably very difficult, but really fun. So characters, and then setting is your second box, then your conflict or problem. And then that last box, instead of a resolution, we're going to write first choice, because that's what we're really working towards. By the end of this workshop, you'll have all of that background information ready, and then you'll have your first choice. And from there, you can start outlining all the other choices that will come after. So I'll give everyone a little bit of time to divide their paper up. Okay, and hopefully everyone has their paper ready. So we're going to start with that first box, which is your character or characters. And this is usually just letting your imagination run wild. Now, in the case of Choose Your Own Adventure Spies, that series is always based on a real person from history. And sometimes that's a great way to get into your character and into your book, because if you're writing about a real person, like I did with Noor, you can just do a lot of research and you sort of get a feel for who the person was and what makes them tick and what was important to them. And those are always very important things to know about any character you're writing about, whether they're real or make-believe. But some other examples are just like occupations you're really interested in, like a deep sea diver, mountain climber, a ninja, or just whoever you want to be or whoever you are right now. So maybe you're a kid in the Pacific Northwest. You could write from your perspective and put yourself in a Choose Your Own Adventure novel, right? Whoever you want to be, this is a great time to sort of think about that and write about that experience. So a couple of things that you want to note when you're talking about a character or figuring out who you are. It's not enough to just know a name and sort of occupation and those kinds of things. I want you to think deeply about this character. What do they value most? Or what are a number of things that they value most? Think of yourself in your own life. You could probably list things like family, friends, maybe you have a passion for something. Maybe you're passionate about writing and that's why you're here, right? What are those things that are important to you? Because those are the things that we usually make our decisions with in mind, right? So for example, if you care very much about family, but you also care very much about your career and you have this career opportunity that's super amazing and going to take you places, but it's also very far away from your family, right? That's a big, I mean, that's a common life decision that's really big for a lot of people because you're weighing two very important things to yourself. So take a moment to just jot down some bullet points in that first box about who you are as a character, what's important to this character, what do you think they would have a struggle with deciding between, right? So in the case of Noor, she grew up, the first thing that I thought of was she grew up as a pacifist, the real life Noor Inayat Khan, but she also cared very much about providing justice in the world and fighting for justice. And so those two things kind of come in conflict when she's thrust in the middle of a war, because war by its nature is not necessarily pacifist, right? So she has to sort of decide, well, am I going to push for justice in the way that I believe and sacrifice these other beliefs that I also hold very dear to me? And that's a big thing that she has to juggle with in the European timeline of the book. And I think that's something she struggled with as a real person. Just knowing from her research, from my research about her, certain things that she explained to the people who knew her. So go ahead and take a couple of minutes. And if you want to know more details about that, feel free to jot down a question in that question box. And we can talk a little bit more about Noor at the end. Hopefully I'll go for one more minute and then we'll move on to the next thing. Okay, so let's go on to the next slide. And this is our second box. So this is our setting. So when we're thinking about setting, there are two things you want to think about. You want to think about where you are physically, and then also when, right? What time period are you in? Because that can bring in some new opportunities and some new obstacles. For example, with Noor's story, right? She's in the book, you can choose either to stay in Europe or you could go to the subcontinent, to India. And those are two very different settings. Then there's also the issue of time period. So her story takes place in the late 1930s, early 1940s, right? During the height of the war, basically. And so there are different things that you can and can't do, right? There are technologies that don't exist back then that if I was writing in the present, I could use, or if I was writing in the future, right, there would be so many opportunities. I could have flying cars, I could have aliens, I could have whatever I imagine, because the future is so open-ended. Right, also in spaces, right, you can have real places like Noor's book, or you could just have a make-up place, right? Any place you want. So go ahead and think about those things. And while you're thinking about that, think about what obstacles might be there, right? If you're in space, what planet are you on? Is it a make-believe planet? What are some things in that environment that might be interesting for your character to interact with, right? Maybe there's no oxygen and they have to figure out a way to create oxygen for themselves. Or maybe there's not much to eat and so they have to learn how to plant and grow food in this new environment. So go ahead and just jot down some things about where and when you are. When you are. I'm not sure that's grammatically correct, but we'll go with it. And while you guys are writing that down, I'll share a fun story about when I was writing the book. So at one point, you know, the first choice is to go either to stay in Europe or to go to India. And so this scene right here, I'll put it a little closer. This is Noor going to India, and she goes by ship. And at the time, I wanted to write out that the captain goes on the loudspeaker and announces that, you know, they're going to arrive in, I think they're arriving in Mumbai. But through the process of editing and with the fact checkers, it was pointed out, loudspeakers didn't really exist back then. So we had to change that so that it didn't sound like, you know, this new technology was all of a sudden invented for this one ship back then. So those are some things to keep in mind. Research is always great. And actually, I would say, and I didn't say this before in some other workshops, I wish I did. I think research is great even for make-believe places, just because it gives you a sense of making things a little more realistic for your reader. So for example, there's so many books out there about world building. There's one book that I really like, but I can't remember the name of it right now. But I would highly suggest things like that, or just look at an atlas. I mean, the world is crazy when you look at just the terrain of the world. It's incredible. Like here in Portland, pretty much every mountain is an active volcano. That I did not know. It terrifies me sometimes. But I mean, that's crazy. There's beautiful, perfect little peaks and snow, and people go skiing and climbing, and they're volcanoes, right? Compared to like the volcanoes in, say, Hawaii, right? Which are oozing lava and just like, you know, the classic idea of what we think for a volcano. All right, so hopefully I've stalled enough and people have jotted down some things. Let's go on to that. We're going to go on to the last two boxes because they're very closely related. But before we do that, let's talk about writing. So there are two basic things about actually writing a choose your own adventure book that I want to go over, and this is about language, right? So the first one is point of view. Commonly in fiction, you'll see first person point of view, which is I, me, my, or you'll see third person point of view. So she, her, he, his, right? Choose your own adventure books, because they're about you, the reader, are written in second person. So you ran and jumped the fence. You know, went underwater into the sea, right? Whatever it is, we're always writing in terms of you doing something. So that can be really hard for people who aren't used to writing in second person very often. I don't write in second person normally. So that was something that I struggled with. My suggestion, just based on my own experience, is write whatever is easiest and then go back and change it. So if you are more used to writing in first person or third person, just write your story out that way. And then you can just go back and change everything into second person. It makes things a little faster, and you know, art is in the revision anyway, so everyone's going to revise. It's the hardest part. but it is also the most creatively fulfilling part if you let it. So that's point of view. The other thing then is passive versus active voice. Now, again, I'm not going to say one is better than the other, but in terms of choose your own adventure book or a game book, active voice is the one that you want to use more often. So, for example, passive voice, the definition is verbs that show the subject is undergoing the action. And you can even see that that sentence itself is passive voice is undergoing rather than underwent or undergoes, which is the direct verb. Right. Now, the benefit of passive voice, I think in general, is that it can help with rhythm. It can make your writing sound more introspective, like you're thinking on the inside. But it doesn't help when you want like an action scene, right? That's where you want active voice. So that's the verb shows the subject taking the action, right? So it creates a sense of urgency. It makes it feel real, like it's happening right then and there. And you can see the very simple examples there. So example 1 for passive voice is Jane was running. Example 1 for active voice, Jane ran. You can see that one is more punchy, it's more direct. And actually, I'm going to use a part from the book as an example. So, and I'll show you guys the picture because I really love this moment. Illustrator did such a great job. So this is Noor basically smacking a Nazi guard with her radio case. Right, so this was written in active voice in the book, and I tried to turn it to passive voice. You're going to hear that it sounds very awkward. Right, so in passive voice, we are under attack, you hear someone yell. A troop of Nazi soldiers are bursting through the back door. Fall back, Emil yells. He's pushing you back. Run, Noor, take your radio and run. Screams and gunshots are all around you. As you round the corner, you're running headfirst into a Nazi. You slap him with your radio case, and he is knocked against the wall. You can hear that very wordy, lots of words in your mouth, basically. Versus active voice, I want you to hear the difference in this. We're under attack, you hear someone yell. A troop of Nazi soldiers burst through the back door. Fall back, Emil yells. He pushes you back. Run, Noor, take your radio and run. Screams and gunshots are all around you. As you round the corner, you run headfirst into a Nazi. You slap him with your radio case, knocking him against the wall. So again, you can hear that difference. And the highlights are there for you to follow along and see the changes so that you can visually see what it looks like as passive voice and active voice. You can see that active voice, there's the direct verb. There's no couching it with a to be verb like are is, right? And then you can see that it makes the language a little simpler and it makes the action very direct. So that's all I'm going to say about that. If you're used to writing in passive voice more often than active voice, same advice as before. Write whatever's easiest for you or however's easiest, and then just go back and revise. And that's actually what I ended up doing for a lot of sections in the book because I'm not used to writing actions, or before this book, I wasn't really used to writing action scenes. So that helped a lot. Also reading a lot of action scenes, books that have a lot of action in them, that's always a great reference. And comic books too, you know, because there's nothing more direct than like a whack, you know. Those are great. Okay, so those were 2 writing things that I just wanted to make sure that we addressed. So now we're going to talk about those last 2 books, right? Creating action always comes through your books, I meant boxes, but they always come through your conflict or your problem. So everything stems from the same root, if that makes sense, right? If you think about your choose your own adventure book, you have a timeline that comes before this book starts, and then that first choice sort of splits everything off into different timelines. If you're a comic book fan, think of like the multiverse in DC Comics or in Marvel, right? The idea that there's simultaneous timelines happening all at once, and the choices you make funnel you into different ones. And choose your own adventure books basically work that way too. So in this case, you've thought about your character, you know what they value. So your problem needs to center around something that they value. That's what makes the choice more meaningful as they come along. So we have some examples right here. I'm going to read that first one just so that you can see an example of a choice, right? Let's say that this character considers themselves a very upstanding person, very honorable, right? You're walking to school and you see a bank robbery. just as the thieves are stashing the cash in a getaway car, one of them turns and looks directly at you. Do you go to the cops even though they saw your face, or should you keep silent? So in this case, right, this person values their integrity, their honesty, but generally most of us, we value our safety as well, right? So that's what this character would be balancing. That's what your reader would be balancing. Should I do what I think is right and sacrifice my safety, or should I stay safe but sacrifice my integrity? So those are the kinds of choices you want. If it's something which we call a which way choice, like do you go left or right? Left or right doesn't mean anything. It's arbitrary. You want a choice with meaning, a choice with consequences, right? Now, left and right can work if there really is a difference between left or right. I'm not saying don't do that, but try not to rely on those so much. You can look at that second example. You've traveled all the way to Kathmandu, Nepal in hopes of finding some trace of a Yeti. When you arrive, your friend and climbing partner, Carlos, is nowhere to be found. Should you head out into the dangerous snowy peaks and search for him, or stay safe, right? Again, a similar choice. You value your friendship, you value this friend, you also value your safety, and one is going to have to give up for the other. So those are the kinds of choices we mean. So what I'd like you to do before we get to that first choice box, in the problem box, I want you to think of some problems that might come up for your character, some ways that they might be challenged to really think about what they actually value. So go ahead and put some bullet points. Some common things are, like you saw in the example, a friend has gone missing, or you witness something great happening, or you get a chance to join a group that's doing something. So in Noor's case, she gets the chance to join the SOE, right? And she could choose to decline it. She did have a life before. She was a writer. She was a published children's author before the war broke out. So she could have stuck with that life, but she chose to join the SOE. So I'll give everyone a couple minutes to just write out some problems that they're thinking of. Okay, hopefully everyone's bullet pointing or writing bullet points about their problems. Okay, so while you're doing that, let's talk about that first choice. So now you have sort of the background all worked out. You know who your character is, where and when they are, what their main problem is going to be, right? So now you want that first choice to really reflect that problem. So again, in Noor's case, right, her problem is that she sees injustice happening, she wants to do something about it, but the only way to do something about it is to leave her pacifist beliefs behind, at least for a while during this war, right? So her first choice then reflects that in the book. She can either choose to stay in Europe and possibly join the war effort, or she can choose to leave Europe altogether and go to India, where she would be safe and far away from the war itself. Obviously, there are other things going on in India at the time, so she continually through the book, I think you'll find that or you as the reader actually, on her behalf, will have to make those decisions about, do I stick with this one way of being, or do I change to fit the circumstances that I'm in? And that's a big choice. I think that's something we all do in our lives, just day to day. So if you're thinking about your choices, I would highly recommend just reflecting on your own life. Think about the biggest choices you've had to make. You know how you struggle with them. And if you're struggling in that same way with the choices that you're writing for your character, you know that that's a good choice to make. If the choice feels easy, it's probably not necessary. you want those difficult choices in the book. And then that's really the end. I want to talk a little bit about next steps, and then we can open up for Q&A. So you have sort of the beginning blueprint for your choose your own adventure story, right? You have your character, your setting, your conflict, and then your first choice. And maybe right now you're just jotting down what those first choice or first choices are. Now, the cool thing is that once you have that first choice down, everything kind of just snowballs. It's very intuitive. You know, you come up with new scenarios and you have new choices, and you just keep going and going and going until you naturally hit an end, which is really fun. So let's say that you've done that. You have your blueprint that we just worked on. The next thing you might want to do is actually outline all the choices that you're going to make. And this is actually the process that Choose Your Own Adventure uses as a publisher, right? You come up with the first few pages, which establishes your character, setting, conflict, and first choice. And then after that, you don't actually write any pages. You outline every other choice and ending that comes after. And once you've done that, you've made sort of your chart or your tree of choices. Then you go back and actually start writing out the pages. So I'm going to show you what my first draft looked like. So on my first draft, I had finished that outline, and then I was preparing to write. And so what I ended up doing was I actually mapped out every timeline in the book. So you can see up here I have first choice, second choice, third choice, right? So I just put the page numbers according to the outline. So pages 1 to 4, on page 4 you hit the first choice. And then you can choose to go to page, in this case it was 186. That's a funny story. The book is not 186 pages long. At least the final isn't. But that's the second choice. And then it goes on from there, and you can see how the page numbers go all the way down to whether I hit a loop or an end. You can see the ends marked in red. And then I would just go back once I hit an end and start all over and pick maybe the same choice until I get to something different. It's just like reading a book. For those of you who grew up reading Choose Your Own Adventure books, right? You know how you're like holding your thumb in certain places or in your fingers in certain places so that you can go back and make different choices. This is essentially the same thing. I just put on a spreadsheet so I could see it all visually. And then that helped me keep track of the pages that I was writing, right? So as I wrote out the pages, so once I finished pages 1 to 4, I just crossed out this whole column because it's all the same page number. Then when I wrote out pages 186 to 188, crossed all those out and went on from there. And the reason that this is really helpful too is if you're using loops where one storyline converges into another, this helps you keep things consistent because you know how you got to where you are, and you can reread through that timeline to make sure it's all consistent. But that is just for your next steps. I know that Choose Your Own Adventure is providing a PDF for you to actually, that you can print out, or there's also a Google Slides version. So if you don't have a printer, you can type. But then you can actually write out your story once you have your outline done and actually make it a real book, which I think is exciting. And I really encourage you to do that if you're interested in continuing with your story. But that's really the end. You just kind of snowball until you hit the endings. So I'd love to talk about the book with Noor, and I'd love to get to your questions.
Yeah. Yeah, can you tell us a little bit about the book and how you came to learn about Noor Inayat Khan, who, as you said, was an actual spy during World War II, and how you decided to write this book about her?
Yeah. So actually, it's very, I mean, it feels like fate in a lot of ways. So I learned about Noor when I was in college, which is like about a decade ago. And I think it was because at the time a children's picture book had just come out. I think it was called Spy Princess or something like that. And I was reading, I'm a Muslim myself, just like Noor was. She's a Sufi, or she was a Sufi. But I was reading through this list of like upcoming books at the time written about famous Muslims in history. And so that was one of the books on that list. And that's when I first heard about her. And then I started researching because, you know, I think a lot of the times in history, you don't learn about I'm going to say like a diverse group of people who really came, like it sounds like when you think of World War II and the way it's typically taught is you have the European powers, so the Axis and the Allies and the United States, and it's very male dominated in the way it's taught. It's very much about the wars. If you have a really great teacher, you really do dive into the Holocaust itself, which I think is important, but that's not always necessarily the case. So, you know, it was just interesting to go, oh, here's a Muslim brown woman who's working on behalf of the Allies in World War II. I'd never heard of this before. So I got a little obsessed and did some research on her. And then it wasn't until, you know, 9-10 years later that Choose Your Own Adventure, they had already come up with the idea of writing a book about Noor. And they were looking for writers. So what ended up happening, I'm actually going to stop sharing my screen. All right, so what ended up happening is I was invited because I knew Catherine Factor, who's another Choose Your Own Adventure writer, and she was actually a teacher of mine when I was in high school. She listed my name among other names for them to look at, and they invited me to apply. And they asked me, you know, do you know about Noor Inayat Khan? I was like, yeah, actually, funny enough, I do. So that was really cool.
That is cool. Are you working on any other Choose Your Own Adventure books or any other projects right now in the pipeline?
Yeah, I have. So I'm not officially working on any other Choose Your Own Adventure books, but I have an idea that I want to pitch to them down the road. I'm still doing some preliminary research, but it's centered around, it's another spies book. It's centered around World War I. It's set in the Middle East, and it follows sort of the building of the modern Middle East. So think of, like, for those history buffs out there, the Sykes-Picot Agreement and basically what built the Middle East as it is now. So from my bio, you know that I grew up in Kuwait, so those issues have always been very important to me. So I'd like to write about it. So that's what I'm working on in terms of Choose. The other thing I'm working on is a poetry manuscript because I am a poet by training, I guess, more so. And I always write stuff and then don't submit and don't do anything with it. So I'm forcing myself this year to actually do something with it and finish the manuscript by the end of the year.
Okay, so it sounds like you're staying busy in that case.
Yep.
Okay, let's see. Jennifer would like to know, what was your biggest inspiration, I guess, as a writer, as a poet?
My biggest inspiration. You know, when I was a kid, the thing that I loved, so I grew up, I was always a reader. I loved to read, and I think a lot of it was very much escapism, just to escape what was going on around me as a kid. And I loved, there was this book series called Princess Diaries, and it's not like the Disney Princess Diaries, like it was, each book was centered around an actual princess from history. And my favorite one was the one on Anastasia Romanoff. And I remember reading those books and reading Babysitter's Club when I was little. And then when I got to middle school, I started reading fantasy and science fiction. And that just blew my world open. And I really am inspired by the fact that writing is really just exploration. It's adventure seeking in the comfort of your own home for those of us who didn't have the ability to go out as much. So I think that's always my inspiration continually throughout my life. I find that I always go back to certain books or certain ideas that I picked up along the way and just am always constantly floored. And then also, you just go out and you read new things, and there's so much happening in the literary world right now, just so much innovation and so much creativity. So I think that's my constant motivation and inspiration.
Yeah. And
I hope that answers your question.
Yeah. Are you reading anything right now that you could tell us about or that you'd recommend?
Right now I'm reading the biography of Wonder Woman by Jill Lepore, which is fascinating. So I'm reading that, and I'm slowly getting through it. I've just been really busy. And then I recently finished a biography. It was Ramadan this past month. And so I try to read like more religious things, I guess. So I read a biography on the Prophet Muhammad by Karen Armstrong. It's a really big one that came out way back when. So that was cool. It's interesting to read history and read about real people and how we interpret them, mostly because that's really what history is. It's our interpretation of things that happened.
Yeah.
And then also I'm reading Julia Quinn. I'm reading a romance novel, the latest Julia Quinn book that came out. I'm almost done with that. So some light reading, nothing too big. In terms of poetry, I'm reading Documents by a friend of mine, Jan Henry Gray, and that is a phenomenal book. If you are interested in poetry, he is so innovative. I had to put the book down for a while because I was like, this is so much, and I'm so incredibly jealous. It's amazing.
Yeah. Drinking from a fire hose. I understand that feeling. Cool. Well, thank you so much. Let's see if we have any other questions. Oh, did you always want to be a writer? Lacey wants to know.
Yes, I did. In fact, there's a home video somewhere where I am really sulky and my dad's filming and my siblings are doing some athletic thing. I was not a very athletic child when I was very young. I was very sickly a lot of the time. And I just I'm pouting and I just go, all I can do is suck my thumb and write. And that, I mean, to this day, aside from the thumb sucking, it's pretty much true.
Gave that up. That's good.
Yeah.
Oh, that's cute. That's cute. Well, Rana, thank you so much for doing this with us. If you are interested, you may order Choose Your Own Adventure Spies, Nora and I at Kant by Rana from Midtown Reader by phone or online. We are also doing private browsing by appointment right now, and next week we'll go ahead and open up to a limited number of customers in the store at the same time, taking lots of precautions to make sure everyone stays distanced and safe. So we hope to see you in the bookstore soon. Rana, when your poetry book comes out, I hope you'll come to Midtown Reader when we're past all this. We'd love to visit with you in person. And
I would love that. Thank
you everybody for joining us. And thank you again to Choose Co., publisher of the Choose Your Own Adventure series. This was awesome. We really appreciate your time. Thank you. Thank you all so much for coming. Yeah, thanks everybody.